Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Perfect. All right, some of you guys know who I am already then. I can hear the chuckling. You knew that was coming. For those who don't know me, my name is Donovan Brown. As I explained earlier, I am a TSP. I am essentially a sales guy. Today, June 1st, my role changes, and I will be a senior program manager responsible for the stuff that I'm about to show you and how it integrates with everything else that is inside our DevOps pipeline. Very excited about that role. I blog constantly at donovanbrown.com. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm catching up on my buddy Jeffrey Snover. He's at 10K. I'm not. So do your part so that I think I'm about 9,000 shy right now. So help me out. Follow me on Donovan Brown. And every time I blog, I tweet, right? So it makes it really easy to keep up with what I'm tweeting and what I'm blogging about. You don't have to do the SSR feed. Some fun stuff real quick. I happen to be the 12th best air hockey player on the planet. So if we can find an air hockey table, I can prove it. It is not what you expect. This is not your Chuck E. Cheese air hockey. These are grown men taking this game way too seriously. It's actually incredible. If you are kind of interested in that, I run a channel on YouTube called Pro Table Sports, just all one word, and you can see some of the best in the world playing this game. It's actually pretty intense. I'm also a competitive driver. I drive an M3. I have an obsession with BMW, so I happen to drive that little black M3 there, and I love it. The reason I mention those things is because I also am a developer, and I find a way to put development into all my hobbies. So I have basically websites that back every hobby that I ever do. Right? It's just kind of what I do. I sling code. I'm one of you guys, right? That's why we were talking about migrations in C# and C++. I've been there. I do it every single day. Matter of fact, I pushed changes to DLB Racing last night. When I got back to the hotel room. It's just what I do. So feel free to ask me any of those types of questions. Some of you guys have seen me speak before. This is going to be a little different than the sessions that I've given before. I want this to be a little bit more intimate. It's not just me coming up here to perform for you guys. This is about really being able to go back to your organizations today and start using release management effectively. I've already been using it since we acquired it at Microsoft. So it's been about a year and a half of me helping customers implement this, answering numerous questions on my blog and on Twitter about how to use this, and I want to share that information with you guys today. Okay, so that's what this is about. This won't be the dog and pony show demo. That's tomorrow. So if you really want to see an end-to-end of the brand new stuff that we just released, and it is really, really cool. How many of you are using the old system? I'm sorry. Okay, it looks so much better now. Right, that fat client WPF app that you guys have been using, it is no longer, right? It's all really, really cool stuff. You'll be able to see it in flight tomorrow. But today is about understanding why we need release management, how we use release management, and the best practices for doing so. Everyone in the back, there's plenty of seats still up here in the front. I'm sure guys will be more than happy to let you sit down, so I don't want people to be uncomfortable for 75 minutes. Why do we need it? The reason that we need it is historically we've been a waterfall company. A lot of us, right, where we go and we do all this planning up front, we all do all this development, then we do all this testing, and then we spend a year trying to put it into production, right, because we had all these assumptions that simply did not work. We switched to be a little bit more agile. Agile allows us to produce code more rapidly, but then we ended up with a bottleneck because as the developers are able to produce the code, our operations teams were not able to deploy it as quickly. Right? So now all of a sudden we have this bottleneck here of like all this great value sitting in the pipeline and no way to get it out. And then when we did try to get it out, it was very complex. I mean, I've heard of 300-page documents on how to deploy the application into production. And they have to do that every single time they want to deploy it. And obviously, they don't want to do that very often. Not only is it complex, it's very error-prone because it's all done by human beings. There's some poor guy there that is actually trying to do these steps. I tell a story, and I'll tell it tomorrow. So you got to come tomorrow to hear about it, about this someone who had to do this and how badly it can go. Okay, I'll save that for tomorrow. And obviously it's chaotic because as soon as something bad happens, you're frantically trying to roll things back. And what we want to do is alleviate all of that by allowing you to automate it with a tool called release management. Before we started, I started asking people, what is your definition of DevOps? And automation was one of those. The other one was breaking down the barrier between operations and developers. One of them was taking the information from the actual running in production and utilizing that in your product backlog to make sure you're delivering the right thing. And I believe it's all of those things. So all we're going to be talking about today, though, is one piece of the true DevOps pipeline, which is the part where we're going to do automation. So let me talk to you about what are we trying to actually automate. We're trying to automate all of this, not just a portion of it, but we literally want to automate the provisioning of an environment. That means using tools like Chef or Puppet, right, which are really good at standing up environments that are brand new. We have ARM inside of Azure, so the Azure Resource Manager, that will allow you to stand up an entire environment, network and all, inside of Azure. But after that infrastructure is stood up, we then have to go back in and configure it. Again, something Chef is really good at. How many of you guys are familiar with desired state configuration? Good, good. The number of hands are going up, or much more than they used to be. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this talk as well, because we're really heavily relying upon that, because that's going to allow us to configure that environment. Once the environment has been provisioned and configured, we now have to install our application on it. So we're going to basically be copying bits, deploying databases. After the application has been installed, we now have to configure it. Web.configs, app.configs, all have to be updated to make sure they point at the right applications. They point at the right databases, the right web services, and such. We talked a little bit about coded UI tests before we started and things like Selenium. We have the ability to actually run those during your release. So we've copied the files out there, we've provisioned everything, and we've configured everything. Now let's run tests to verify that the application is running as expected. We don't have to wait for human beings to go on there and run a battery of regression suites. We can do that automatically for you. And should all those tests pass, we can even promote it to the next environment for you as well. But there's no reason we can't pause and allow you, because try as you will, try as you might, there are going to be some tests that are just going to be easier to run manually. Right? You're looking for visual aspects of the screen. You're not looking for numbers that I can actually scrape. And we're going to need to run some manual tests. That's fine. We'll wait for you. We'll let you run those manual tests, and then you give us the approval to go ahead and move forward. Okay? And then after that, we're going to be able to send throughout this entire process notifications to people who are interested and solicit approvals from those who are required to allow us to move out of and into different environments throughout our pipeline. So how does this all work? Very quickly, a lot of you guys have seen this slide already. So I'll go over it pretty quickly. In the center of the world is a server. The RM server holds all the information that we need to about the configuration, the environments, and actions that we want to take on your behalf. We collect this information, and then we try to deploy it out to these individual nodes or targets. And as you can see by the icons, we can support Linux, Azure, Windows, you name it, we can deploy there. If you can show me a PowerShell script that can do what you want to do, I can incorporate it inside of this system here. Right? That's the golden rule. We take that information and through a catalyst, and the catalyst could either be a user or a build, and we will then take that information and start packaging it up and simply deploying it out to the environments. We can use Chef, Puppet, desired state configuration, PowerShell scripts. Whatever you're using today to move bits around, we can simply sit release management right on top of that, giving you all the power and flexibility that is release management on top of your current infrastructure. So let's start talking about the best practices here. This is the golden rule of our build system and our RM system. If you can show me a PowerShell, I can actually do whatever it is you just showed me as part of our release. So that should have answered 90% of the questions, because I know I was about to get asked, Donovan, can we deploy SharePoint? Can you show me a PowerShell that can deploy SharePoint? Yes? Well, then the answer is yes. Donovan, can you deploy Oracle changes? Can you show me a PowerShell that will call some Oracle tool that will deploy your changes for you? The answer is yes, then the answer is yes. Right, so this is the golden rule. If you don't remember anything else about the 75 minutes we're about to spend together, it is if I can do it from PowerShell or even any CLI, what I mean by that is a command line interface, I can now do that inside of my release pipeline. And I get all that extra stuff, automatic rollbacks or triggering a rollback. I get the approvals, I get the notifications, I get the manual interventions, I get the automated testing, I get all that cool stuff that RM brings to the table simply by adding it to the PowerShell that I already have. If you don't know PowerShell, learn PowerShell. It's just that simple. You're going to want to download this deck. I believe I already published it. If not, I will make sure that Ignite has this slide deck, because on the bottom of every slide are links to more information and other tech talks, and some of them are to my blog post on how to make sure you're doing the best thing possible to get your PowerShell to play nicely inside this environment. Okay, so make sure you download the deck. I'll make sure they have it as well. So if you can do it from PowerShell, you can do it from release management. Tokenization. How many ASP.NET developers do I have? I'm a big ASP.NET. I love my ASP.NET. How many of you guys have been burned by web.config? Everyone raise your hands again. Right? Because if you aren't raising your hand, you're not really an ASP.NET developer. We've all gone in there onto the production and quickly made a change and got the yellow screen of death. Right? You left off an angle bracket. You forgot to close your quotes. You just did something careless. Or God forbid you have production pointing at the QA database. Or worse, QA pointing at the production database. Because you went in there and you manually changed it. Other companies said, oh, no, we don't touch them in production. What we do is we just have dozens of copies of it in version control. Right? So inside version control, I will find a folder called configurations. And inside that folder, I will find one that says dev and QA and production. And inside that folder is finally a perfectly baked web.config for each one of those environments. It's a maintenance nightmare. I change one of those files, I must remember to change them all. Otherwise, it's going to work in QA and not work in production because I forgot to make the change in the production version of my web.config. All right? Not only that, I have to make sure that whatever tool that I'm using that is pulling the web.configs pulls the right one. My script might accidentally pull the QA web.config and put it in production. So there's a lot of issues with having multiple copies of your web.config. Don't be ashamed if that's what you're doing. We used to tell people to do that, right? Because that was the best practice at the time. But then we got better. We started doing things like the tokenization files. If you expand your web.config, it'll have another web.config underneath it, one for dev and one for release. And what's really cool about these files is it allows you to only track the differences, not the things that are the same amongst all your web.configs. So now when I compile it for debug, I get a web.config that's perfect for debug. When I compile it for release, I get a web.config that's perfect for release. What's the problem with what I just said? When I compile it, I have to know what the target environment is. So if I compile it for release, great, I have a perfect web.config for my production environment. But I have to go through dev and QA and UAT and staging before I can get to production. So what good is that web.config? It's no good. So I'm still back to manually modifying it in those environments and running a risk of a yellow screen of death. So we want to stop doing that as well. What we really want to do is tokenization. Tokenization is the concept to where we only have one copy. We have the web.config and then one additional copy. It's going to be web.config.token, for example. In that file, you simply tokenize the parts that you're going to want to be able to replace at deploy time. We don't want to make a decision at compile time. We need to make this decision at deploy time. As I'm deploying into the dev environment, that's when I need to tell you what values I need. When you promote it from dev into QA, that's when I want you to switch the values from what they were in dev to what they need to be in QA. I need to store it with the stage, not inside a source control and not inside of a particular transformation file. Now, I have a link here. Now, there's a really sexy combination of the two of these. You can actually take that transform file to generate your token file. Right? One of the developers of the RM team named Jonathan actually wrote this really cool blog post that says, well, why don't we just use the best of both worlds? I'm going to use the tokenization to when it's compiled, it actually produces the target file or this tokenized file that RM actually wants. So it's kind of cool. So if you really want to, the easiest way is just make a copy and tokenize it yourself. The sexier way is to use the transform file to actually tokenize the web.config for you. So it's just another option. This is hands down my favorite feature of release management because we'd been burned so many times. We'd already written all the scripts. We already have a battery of PowerShell that will deploy our application, but that PowerShell did not do this very well, and not in my experience anyway. Right? We still struggled with this. So when I saw this inside of release management, I was like, okay, this is really, really cool stuff. If you've been using release management for a long time, you know that there's an agent-based solution and there's also a vNext solution. The vNext solution does not have this. The level of frustration, you have no idea. I lost it. Right? I said, you guys are telling me that this is vNext, but the coolest feature you had in the old one is missing in the new version? How is this possible? Because it was all based off a desired state configuration, which we will talk about later. One of the cool things about desired state configuration is that it runs off resources. Resources which you can write yourself. First resource I wrote, I brought this back for us. Right? So even if you want to use the next version, you can actually still use tokenization as I've described it with the vNext product. It's a free download. I became a ranger specifically so that I could publish this in a way that it was supported by Microsoft. Okay, so don't worry, this is in the new product as well. Any questions? And actually, again, this is a little bit more different than what I normally do. I normally hold questions till the end. I'm willing to take questions, but only on the slide that we're on. So I have a feeling the other questions I'm going to answer as we go through the rest of the slides, okay? So are there any questions over tokenization before we leave it?
I see you can use it for instance, a whole database name, but what if you have to change a large part of XML? How will you go about that?
Okay, so the question is, I can see how you can change just the name of a particular item, but what if I have a big blob of XML or a section of XML that I have to change? The token can be expanded to whatever you tell me it needs to be expanded to. So what you're going to do inside of the user interface is that there's a section that says, I have now a token called database. And this is the big string I want you to put there, or little string. It could literally be XML that you want me to put in there. Great question. Another question? Oh, that's a fantastic question. I should have mentioned that. You can tokenize any text file. It does not have to be a config file. It does not have to be XML. Inside of the Java world, they use something called a properties file, is what I found out, right? So when I did my demo that I'm doing on Thursday or tomorrow, it's a Java application deployed to a Linux machine, but it points to web services that are created by .NET, and they're different for each environment. So I had to find a way to store it in a way that I could change it. It happens to be something called a properties file. Looks a lot like an INI file. And I was able to tokenize that so that I could change the URLs to which they point for the web services using this exact same technique. Oh, good question. No, it's not. It's very similar. Slow Cheetah is a plugin that you can add on that adds a little bit to the tokenization that comes out of the box. The difference is this only happens when you're trying to publish it with one of these two different configurations, where Slow to Cheetah happens every time you hit F5. Good question. One more. It is. So the question was, are the tokens, the actual values that I want to be used in their replace, stored inside of release management? The answer is yes. So inside of release management, I'm able to define these values for each individual stage in which I want to deploy to. Absolutely. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Next best practices. Cross-domain and workgroup. You will find this is a challenge for a lot of companies. The devices or the environments in which I want to deploy to are not in the same domain as my TFS. Right? So how do I get access to that drop location? How am I able to cross that domain boundary? There's a couple ways. First way, some people like, some people don't like, is what we call shadow accounts. A shadow account is an account on each machine with the exact same name and the exact same password. Even though they're in different domains, RM will be able to go across that boundary using that account. Some people like them, some people don't. If you don't like them, then obviously you can have a trust. Right? In your Active Directory, you can produce a trust, and that trust will allow the data to go across. In our next version of our product, we will actually be able to co-locate the agents that are running your commands in the domain in which they're actually being executed. So there's lots of options. That last one is just for our new stuff that I'm going to be showing you tomorrow. Okay? The old stuff, you're going to either need to do shadow accounts. Again, a shadow account is simply the exact same name and exact same password. Okay? And then when you add those to RM, it's kind of funny, and I think I have a blog post. I think that's going to tell you how to do that as well. The shadow account has to be added to RM with the workgroup name / the account name, even though you won't technically have access to that. But when that request comes in from us, we'll see the workgroup and the username, and we better see him inside of RM. Right? Once we see him in our RM, we'll give him permissions to do whatever it is that he wants to do, grabbing access to the particular bits that he needs to and things like that. There's another option that I forgot to put on here. Generally what happens is the agent will then go and say, where are the files, right? Where do they exist on a drop location? And I will just reach over there and pull them down myself. But if I can't even reach the drop location, then it's chicken and egg. You can give me all the shadow accounts and two-way trust you want. I simply don't have permissions to that drop location. How do we fix that? What you can do is you can actually tell the release management server, I want you to funnel all the files over HTTP to the agent for me. So the server needs to have access to the drop location, but the agents do not. Right? So there's lots of ways, if you have a really complicated technology or topology, we can get you around it with lots of different techniques that we've used for cross-domain. And that works today in our current system as well. So before I leave that, are there any questions over cross-domain or workgroup modes? That's pretty self-explanatory, right? Oh, actually there is one. Go ahead. Actually, the question is there any plans to integrate this with Azure AD? It is already integrated with Azure AD. So if you're able to create a two-way trust, you're golden. So I want to put cross-domain / workgroup mode because we work in either way. Cross-domain would mean you already have an Active Directory running. If you don't have it and you're working in workgroup mode, we work there as well. Good question. Okay. So what are we talking about next? Next, we're talking about security. This is one of the things that I think release management does really well over some of our competition. You can lock release management down really, really tightly. The problem that most people make, though, is they don't realize that the everyone group is there by default, and everyone is in it by default, and it's everywhere by default. So what they do is they go in and they create all these cool groups, and they put people in there, and they try to lock it down like, Donovan, everyone can still do everything. It's like, yeah, rule number 1, delete the everyone group first. Right? Because everyone is in there and it is everywhere by default. So rule number 1, go in and delete the everyone group if you're trying to lock down RM. Then create your own groups, and those groups can come from Active Directory. Those groups can come from Team Foundation Server groups, or you can create groups that only live inside of RM. You can then add Active Directory users into those groups, and then you can go ahead and say they have permissions over this environment, they have permissions over this stage of that environment, they can see this component. Whatever you want to do, you can actually lock it down really, really tightly. But rule number 1, remove the everyone group. So many people leave it and are completely confused on why everyone can still do everything. And the other one is we support encryption. All the tokens that you tokenize, some of them you're not going to want people to see, right? The values are passwords. Passwords you don't want your developers to know about inside of your UAT or your production environment. That is secure information that only the people in operation should know about. So what we can do is we can actually encrypt those values. So when you create a token, you get to tell us, is it a standard token or is it an encrypted token? And if it's encrypted, we never show the values on the screen, and we also encrypt it actually in the database. So should someone go and compromise your database and start mucking around in there, they'll never see the passwords that they're looking for. Right? So again, release management is highly secure. Manual intervention. This is actually a cool one. Again, try as you will, try as you might, there are going to be steps in your pipeline that simply cannot be automated, or the investment to automate it is too high. It's cheaper just to have someone go in and do that, or you just don't have the comfort level of whatever script or tools you have today to let them do that. You want a human being to actively go into the system and say, yes, I verify that this is done, and I've performed this manual task that you wanted me to perform, and they can say, yes, I've done this or not done this. Should something bad happen here, or the person say, I attempted to do that manually, and something bad happened, if they fail this, it will literally trigger a rollback in our system. We have a really nice rollback system that a lot of other systems don't, and you probably don't have this in your PowerShell. Your PowerShell is very optimistic. It assumes it's going to run, and it assumes everything's going to work great. Should they fail, it just says, hey, man, something bad happened, but your system is left in whatever state it was left in when it errored out. With release management, we can actually track that something bad happened and actually trigger a rollback, give you the opportunity to recover and make sure that your system is left in a really good known state. Well, people are saying we want to make sure that that decision is made by a human being and not just an error code. So what you can do is you can put a manual intervention inside of your pipeline, and then we will simply wait for that user to tell us, is it safe to go or not? We have other approvals in the system, but there are people who just say, no, I want one more level of approval. Not what you have, and the manual intervention is the perfect way to do that. Just drop it where you need to, give the individual instructions on what they're supposed to perform, and if they fail that or reject that step, a rollback will be triggered, and they'll be able to correct whatever it is they want to be able to correct. Any questions over manual? Sure. Not that I'm aware of. That's interesting, because the question I normally get, the question was there a limit on the size of the string that you're able to encrypt? Not that I'm aware of. None that I've ever reached, right? And we've encrypted some big stuff. So I don't know if VJ's in the room. VJ, are you in here? He's not. Where are you? So is there a link? Is there a maximum length? There's not. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are very lucky to have this gentleman in the room with us. Everyone turn around and look at him. His name is VJ. He is the program manager for RM. So it's basically his baby. They let me speak on it, but he's the owner of it. Okay? So any questions that I cannot answer, we have the only guy in the room that can actually answer them. So we're really lucky today. I've never seen a limit. The one thing that... Truncated in the past over 100 characters? There is no limit, but there is a bug. That's the thing. That's the bottom line on that one. Go ahead. Good question. Good question. So the rollback is not a transaction in a database, right? Which we all want it to be. I just want to say, watch what I do, and if I screw up, put it all back the way it was. Doesn't work that way. So what we do in our pipeline is we take steps necessary to be able to restore should something bad happen. So let's say, for example, I wanted to do a database. What I would do before I modified my database is I would take a backup of it. We have a task in our system that says, go make a backup of this database for me. I would then have a task that said, let's go try and update my database. If it fails, the rollback would say, restore the database from the backup you just took, right? But it's not smart enough to say, oh, I saw that he did this and he did that, and now I'm going to roll it back. You have to take steps in your process that say, okay, another example is I'm doing a Xcopy deployment of an ASP.NET application. First thing I would do is I would take the original files that are currently on the machine and I would copy them to another folder. I would then try to X-copy my files over, and should something bad happen, I'd be able to go to that backup copy and then copy them back in my rollback. So that's how the rollback system works. Good question. One more over here.
So we actually supply the anti-pattern for the rollback?
You do, right. So you're gonna take whatever steps necessary as part of your process to prepare yourself to be able to roll back should something bad happen. And then you just basically put in the right task as well. There's a huge list of tools that we have available for you, and obviously all the PowerShell that you can write, you can actually use it in both directions. One more.
If you like to simplify and just use VMware backup, restore, setup, and scripting each and everything.
Sure.
Is there any way we can use specific steps with elevated privileges because the account we're going to use won't have the VM?
Can I have elevated privileges so that I can do some sophisticated PowerShell or things like that? As long as the machine in which is executing it has permissions to run the commands you're going to have, it's going to run it. It's going to run successfully. So what you would do is you'd have to script out in PowerShell, go over and call the VMware API that does a checkpoint or a snapshot like we would in Hyper-V. Go do some stuff, and if not, let's go ahead and roll back or restore back to that snapshot. I did the same thing with Hyper-V. If you watch the demo that I did at TechEd Europe, I actually added my own Hyper-V tool because I wanted to do all this stuff where starting and stopping VMs and everything. I just wrote my own PowerShell and added it as a tool, and it was able to use it directly. You do the same thing with VMware. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next. One more.
Is there any way, in this workflow, I can implement, without deploying to the lower environment, before deploying to production?
You want to skip environments?
No, I don't want to skip. I want to validate. Without deploying Dev and QA, the package will not be into production. Some people, they directly, without deploying to Dev, they're trying to put it in QA. But I want to verify, whether this already been, deployed in Dev.
So the question is there any way to verify that it's gone through all the stages before it reaches a particular deployment? The answer is absolutely yes. What you would do there is you would actually define the pipeline. That is mandatory. Code must go through dev and must go through K before it can ever be considered for production. So there's no way for them to skip or jump or say, I want you to go directly to QA without going through dev. No way to do that. Okay? It literally has to go through the pipeline that you define. Okay. One more. What you'd have to do is, the question is, can we have, even though we just said that's a bad thing to do, is there any way I can do it anyway, right? All right, so the answer is kind of, right? There is no logic inside of the pipeline. There's no if or flow control, right? It's going to do exactly what it's told, and there is a list that says I want to go from this environment to this environment. Now, I can have multiple paths to production, right? So I can have a path that goes dev, QA, prod. And then for a hot fix, we're not going to waste time in dev, right? It's a hot fix. It needs to get to prod immediately. So I would have a completely different pipeline that says just go QA and prod or UAT prod, much shorter. And then what I would do when I initiate the releases, I would get to choose what path do I want this code to go through. But if you've already picked the path that says it must go through dev, there's no way they can skip dev, right? But if you need them to go quicker, then you would actually have a whole other path that says this path will skip dev because it's a hot fix, right? So that's the way you could do that. Okay, so the question is, or the statement is that it can become a maintenance nightmare to have multiple release paths throughout your pipeline because the same activities has to happen over and over again. I believe we're addressing that in the newer product with the templates as well, right? Right, it's almost like an inheritance of the pattern. Exactly. I think we're doing the same thing in build. So today you're absolutely right. We've heard that feedback, and we are working on a solution to where I know that this path inherits from this other path, so anything that I do there will actually come down into my other one as well. So yeah, we completely agree with you. Database changes. So I kind of talked about this before we got started. SSDT, if you're not using it, go investigate it. Right? That's your homework for today. If you did not raise your hand when I said, are you using SSDT but you're using SQL Server, go investigate this technology. Works really well with RM. So in the agent base or the vNext version, we have tools that will allow you to go out and deploy this information. Surprised there's not a a link on this one. I might go back and add a link on this one because I know that I have some blog posts on this particular technology. It allows you to version your entire schema inside of your project. So if you go into Solution Explorer, you'll see your website, you'll see your class libraries, and lo and behold, there's your database with all of its objects in it, all being versioned right alongside. So I used to do this. This is a test. Before I joined Microsoft, I was a process consultant. A process consultant is a guy who basically flies around the world installing and implementing Team Foundation Server. And I would go and I would basically grade people's process and help them become more agile. I'm certified Scrum Master, all that nonsense. So one of the tests that I would give them would say, great, show me your code from a year ago. And everyone would go into their source control, find me a label, and they'd give me the code. I'm like, great, show me the database that matches it. And they'd all start looking at each other like, dude, do we have a database from a year ago? Do we have a backup or something? I'm like, no. Where is the schema that matches that code? If you have a customer who's still using that, how are you supposed to go support them if you don't even have a copy of the database? And this was the answer for them. It's like you need to start versioning that schema alongside the application in which it supports. And SSDT will get you there. You need to make sure that you have a rollback strategy. It already came up, right? We talked about that when we were talking about manual interventions and rollbacks, is the ability to make sure that you plan for that rollback. If you're using SSDT, chances are you're going to be issuing the DAC pack file. You want to make sure you have the previous DAC pack and the current DAC pack, just in case you need to reapply the old one, right? And you need to make sure you reapply it correctly. Because as we mentioned before, the migrations don't like going backwards. By default, SSDT doesn't like it either because it's fearful that it's going to lose data. If you just added a column and now you're asking me to drop the column, by default it's going to throw its hands up and say, you really don't want me to do this. But there's a parameter that I can pass that says, no, I know what I'm telling you to do. Go do what I tell you to do, and it'll drop the column for you as well. So you need to have that strategy thought out, though, to make sure that when you do need to roll back, it doesn't just blow chunks on you because it's like, I'm going to fail again because I don't think you really want to do this. You have to have that plan in place, okay? Care must be taken with deployment slots. How many people are using Azure websites? Not enough hands. We need to work on this too. Azure websites are freaking awesome, right? They are awesome. The ability to scale up and scale down based on a metric, you don't even have to think about it, and we'll realize, oh man, you need more bandwidth. We're going to go ahead and give you 10 instances of your website only for the hour that you need for Black Friday, and then we're going to scale it back down so you only pay for what you need. Really, really cool stuff. IaaS, which we have basically VMs in the cloud, that is just a stepping stone to PaaS, right? It's a quick way to get you out of your data center, guys, but don't get comfortable in IaaS. That is not the holy grail of the cloud. The holy grail of the cloud are websites. Infinite scale at your disposal, instant SLA compliance at your disposal. Much easier to do. And they also come with this really cool feature called deployment slots. So I have this website, and I don't want to just copy files into it, because to copy files into a production website means I have to take it down, because I don't want people accessing it while I'm copying my files up there. So they're going to get this screen saying, we'll be back in a moment. Sorry, we're updating our website or we're doing service packs. With deployment slots, I can actually have another slot sitting right underneath production. I can deploy all my files to that slot while it's running in production. No one in production has anything or is unaware that I'm doing this. And then once all the files have made it, I've run my series of smoke tests against that slot, make sure everything copied correctly. In a moment's notice, I can switch one from the other. Literally zero downtime deployment. That's deployment slots. But what happens when all of a sudden I need to swap back because it didn't act the way that I wanted it to? And I've already made a breaking database change. Right? All of a sudden I swip back to the old version. The old version is also broken now because the schema of the database no longer matches the version of the app I just swapped out of it. So care has to be taken there too. The best practice when you're using deployment slots with databases is no database change you make can break the previous version of your application. So in the event you have to swap back very quickly from what you just put into production to what was in production, the production app will continue to run. The next version that you pushed can finally delete that column that you wanted to delete 2 versions ago. Because even if I swapped it back, no one's expecting that column to be there. So again, if you're using deployment slots, your database cannot break the previous version of your website, because if I have to swap it back because it's not performing the way we expect it to, you're in a really bad position. So that's what I mean by care needs to be taken when you're using deployment slots. I'm actually writing an article specifically on deployment slots because this isn't the only time you need to be wary of that. So now I'll take questions on database changes. We have one here, and I had some over there too.
Yeah, so did I hear, so slots is just for the files and not necessarily for the database?
Very good. Yes, the statement was, did he hear correctly that this is just for the files and not for the database? The answer is yes. When you're swapping slots, you're literally just swapping the website, not the databases in which it replies. Or, I mean, it depends on. Can I run 2 different versions of SSDT simultaneously? Are you saying you're getting an error saying I can't update that database because it's the wrong version? Because I know there's a bit inside of, if you were to right-click on your SSDT project in Visual Studio and go to Properties, it's going to bring up the Properties pane, and you have to target a specific version of a database. So you might want to look there, but you're still going to have some trouble because it doesn't like targeting 2 at the same time. So I had the same problem when I went from on-prem to Azure DB. My first SSDT didn't work, not because it wasn't the right schema, but I had to go into the project and say, you're now targeting Azure DB, and then all of a sudden it was happy. Is that the scenario you think you're having? Interesting. All right, do me a favor. Follow me ping me on Twitter that question, and I'll get you in contact with the SSDT guys. Oh no, that's just for Azure. It's just a website. We have them in cloud services, and we also have them in websites. Yeah.
Differences between the data tools inside Visual Studio and the standalone SSDT SQL Server?
The difference is that we're going to be able to version ours inside of version control because that, I think, just produces the DAC pack or the backpack for you on your hard drive, but there's no versioning of the schema, each individual item. Inside of SSDT, inside of Visual Studio, I see every object, right? And I can either modify it there or I can modify it inside of SQL Server and then just do a schema compare to bring my schema in source control up to date. All right, I'll do a couple more. Give me in the back first. Go ahead. It does. What you can actually do, the question is does SSDT work with multiple databases? The answer is yes. Just like I can have a website that depends on another project inside Solution Explorer, you can have multiple databases and literally reference one database from another so that when you have a cross-database query, it actually resolves that information for you. Quick side note, you can also do cool stuff like refactoring. If I want to rename the name of a column, it will find every other object inside of my database that use that column and rename it for me. Right? It's really powerful stuff. Theirs. Right. The statement is that if I need to make a reference to a database I don't have, that can be a challenge. You can either get a DAC from them, because you don't need the actual database project, but a DAC of their schema will actually allow you to resolve. Same thing that we do for the master database table. So it's not without its challenges, agreed, especially if you're starting to work with other people or external systems. But we do have facilities in place to address that if you can get that DAC from those other vendors. I think we had one right here, and then I'll come to you, and then we'll have to go to the next slide. First deployment slots, yeah.
So if you have a procedure that you're going to sort of essentially break, or the new release won't work with, or the old release won't work with, you have to create a new procedure, for example.
Either the signature has to be the same, such that they can both call. So the question was, do I have to keep the old or make a new store procedure if I'm using deployment slots for my database change? And I'll say it very generically. Your previous application, the one you're about to swap out, should you need to swap back in, better work with your new schema. So that means either, I don't know, I mean, it could be that the signature is the same, but the functionality is different, and then you swap it back and no one's the wiser. It also could be the signature is drastically different, and the old code won't be able to call it. In that case, you're going to have another signature for it. Not deployment slots. Deployment slots are just the app, just the actual website, right? So that'll kind of clarify that for you. All right, let's move on to it. Let's move on to another one. Hold those questions till the end. When we have more time, we'll come back to them. I don't want to not get to all of the slides here. Triggering releases. This is something we get asked a lot. Donovan, we're not using TFS. We're not using team build, but we still want to use release management. How do we get continuous delivery? Right, CD. How do I get that from systems that are not integrated with TFS already? We have several different ways that you can actually trigger a release. You do not have to be using TFS to use RM. Never have. Right? It wasn't a requirement in our first version. I don't believe it's going to be a requirement going forward because you can use Jenkins and you can use whatever build system. We understand you're in other tools already, but we want you to start utilizing ours. So RMO, which is Release Management Online, we can install Release Management on-prem, and you can also just leverage ours in the cloud. So that's what I mean by RMO. That automatically works with our build system, and you can also trigger. We have a command line interface or a CLI that you can call from an MS build script or from a TeamCity build or any build system that you have that can call out to a command line can then tell release management, I'm done and I need you to go pick up the output and start releasing it for me. And then finally, we also have a REST API. So the REST API allows you to, inside of PowerShell, connect to our REST API, make a call, and next thing you know, we'll pick up your bits and start deploying them to you, right? So there's no wrong way to trigger a release. We've given you a lot of options and availability to be able to do that so that you can use whatever build system you're currently using today, yet still leverage continuous delivery. Any questions over triggering a build? Okay. We're working on that constantly, right? The question was, well, when will some of the bugs be fixed? Every release, some of the bugs are fixed. I guess is the best way of saying that. Every release. Which specific bug you're looking for, I'm not sure. Have you had issues triggering builds, though?
Yes, on-premise. Because it always works perfectly, but on-premise, I don't know, the URL is different from the...
Are you using vNext or agent-based? Just curious. So you're using the REST API then, right? Actually, I'm going to go back real quick because that's a good clarification. The command line interface is for your agent-based deployments inside of RM. The REST API is for your vNext deployments out of RM. So you can't mix the two. If it is an agent-based deployment and you try triggering it with the REST API, it will not work, and vice versa. If it is a vNext version deployment and you try triggering it from the command line, it will not work. So could that possibly be what you think you were experiencing?
I tried it with the REST API.
For vNext still not issues. That's interesting. Again, ping me on. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that because I've had nothing but success with that. So definitely, again, I'll put up my Twitter handle up there so you guys can find it, and then just shoot me that question or follow some of these items down here because not only do one of these I know for a fact is not mine. There was another gentleman who wrote an incredible blog post on every possible way to trigger our RM and has great walkthroughs on how to do everything. So if it's a bug, please let me know. I'll get it to VJ and the product team, and we'll get it addressed for you. Rollbacks. We kind of talked about this one already. We kind of got here earlier. It will be able to restore your system based on a failure. Should something bad happen, we will go back in and be able to trigger a rollback so that you can take whatever actions are necessary. If you're a programmer, and most of you seem to be, it's very similar to a try, catch, finally. Right? You're going to try to do something, and should it error, we're going to allow you to catch it. That something bad happened. But there's also the concept of a finally. I just think that we need to change this name, VJ. Rollback always, bad name. Right? It should have been called finally because it will trigger regardless if something bad happened or not. But by the name, it makes me think that if nothing bad happened, it won't get run. But it does actually get run. Right? So the best analogy or the best time I've seen this used in the field, we had a customer who had monitoring on their system, which had to be disabled before they started updating their system, or they would be getting alerts out the wazoo thinking the system is going down. But regardless if it was a successful deployment or not, they had to re-enable their monitoring before they left that particular stage. So they were able to put the rollbacks in place, and then also have a rollback always that said, hey, turn the monitoring back on. Because even if something bad happened, we've already restored it back to its original state, and we need to be monitoring that production environment again. So remember that rollback always gets fired, regardless if it was a successful deployment or not. Any questions? We've kind of talked about this, but are there any other questions on rollbacks? One more. No. Again, the question was, does it track artifact sets? No. For example, if you look at the sample that I have on the screen here, I'm attempting to deploy my database where it says DemoDB. Let me actually, this is a cool feature of this thing. Look at that pointer. Look at that. That's cool. All right. I'm trying to do this. If this fails, it's going to trigger this rollback. Before I did any of this, I did this. I backed up my database first. I attempted to update it, and then if something bad happens, I will restore my database. I have to put those tasks in place. It's not easy enough to say, just watch me try this, and if it fails, figure out what to do to put it back. Right? So it doesn't track any artifacts. If there were deployments I was attempting to make, I would have had to take some step here to set me up for the ability to roll back should something bad happen. Does that answer the question? Okay, so the question is can I roll back if it were an X copy scenario? The difference would be, instead of saying backup SQL database, this task would be copy files, and I would go and find where my target is, my destination, and I would copy those to something called backup first. Then I would try to X copy my files onto that destination area. And if this errors out here, I would simply go to the backup and copy them back to their original location. No. No, everything has to be scripted by you. We just are able to tell you that something bad happened so that you can then take the necessary steps to correct it. Okay? I forgot to tell you guys, too, get your cameras ready because I have a slide in here for free Wintellect. Right? So in a moment, I think, a couple slides, there's going to be a screen that comes up that has a code on it, and you can use that to get some free Wintellect now. So don't leave early. Stay for the gift later. Question?
What activities are included in
There are a lot of them. Almost too many to iterate. There is a lot of them. There's database-specific ones, file access-specific ones, those that you add yourself as well. We have those that manipulate IIS. We have those that manipulate Windows services. The list is enormous. And then you can also, again, download a lot of them. Guys like myself, there's another guy from South Africa named Colin, who does a lot of blogging and a lot of writing of custom tools for this tool set, and we give them away for free. So tools that don't come out of the box, you can just come download from guys like myself. Okay. Setting build quality. This was a very interesting question that came to me. One of our customers was like, Donovan, there is a concept of build quality in your build system. How many of you guys are familiar with the build quality in our build system? Just a handful of you guys. Every build that we produce has a build quality. By default, it's not set to anything, but it has things like ready for initial test, pass smoke test, and you can actually customize that list of qualities of your build. What they were wanting to do was the ability to set the quality based on what stage of the development it had reached, so that they don't have to go in there and manually say it's ready for initial testing or it's past QA testing. They should know that based on what stage that we just entered, on what the quality of that build should be. But we didn't have any tools out of the box, to the question of what tools that we have available, that actually did that. So what I did is I just sat down and I wrote what? PowerShell. Right? There's a script of PowerShell that I can write that can manipulate the quality of a build. So I sat down and I figured out, okay, how do I do this? I have to go find the build, and I know the build based on the build name that RM gives me. I need to then go set the quality to some particular value, and I parameterize this particular PowerShell so that it can be added to RM as a tool. So now the individual is able to just drag and drop this build quality task onto their workflow and say, at this stage, I want you to change it to this value. And then at this stage, I want you to change it to that value. So by the time it got sent to production, it was set in production, and no one ever had to touch that actual build manually with their own hands. So again, you can set the build quality, and the way that you do that is through your own custom tool or basically just a little piece of PowerShell. So this was just a really cool question that I got asked that I thought I'd share with you because I thought it was something that a lot of people should want to be able to do. This is something that might get you. Again, our build system has something called a retention policy. A retention policy is how many versions of a particular build do I want you to keep on our drop location before you start cleaning up after yourselves. Before we had the retention policy inside a Team Foundation server, I would go and help people configure their builds. They start doing CI builds. They're doing 10, 15 builds a day. Those builds are very, very large. And then eventually, a year later, we'd get a phone call saying, Donovan, our builds just started failing. And we'd have to go figure out, well, what the heck's going on there? Well, before we had this feature, your hard drive would eventually just fill up. Right? You have a year's worth of builds, 10, 15 builds a day. There's simply no more space for us to copy them, and the builds would just start failing. Failed to copy to the output location. So Microsoft introduced this new feature called retention. And what this would do is allow us to define, I want you to start deleting every build over the 10th build, allowing it to clean up after itself so that we wouldn't run out of hard drive space. Then we introduced RM, right? Great feature. And every time RM touches a build, it would set that flag saying, I want you to retain this guy indefinitely. That basically says you are outside the law of the retention rules. You stay regardless. So if you went from CI builds 10 to 15 a day to CD builds where you're doing continuous delivery 10 to 15 times a day, you were right back in the same boat you were in years ago, right? All the builds were marked as retain indefinitely. It was essentially not having any retention rules, and eventually your hard drive would fill up. So another question came to me on Twitter, hey Donovan, we're running out of hard drive space. I need a way to tell RM not to set that bit, or at least if it's rejected, clear the bit, right? So that people can go and delete that particular build for us. So what I did, what did I write it in? PowerShell. I literally fired up PowerShell ISE, and I sat down and said, how can I set this bit via PowerShell? And you can actually bring in the Team Foundation Server libraries directly into PowerShell. I went and found the build, and I found the code that said, hey, I can set this bit one way or the other. And then I basically published the file. So I think that's the link down there. You can go and get the PowerShell that I wrote and add it to RM, such that you will now be able to flip that bit to your needs. So I think the way that they're using it today is that they're just leaving it set by default. But then when the build is rejected or the release is rejected at any point, they are going to simply trigger this and say, unflip that bit because I want this to be deleted because it didn't even make it into production. So it gives you that flexibility to extend the tool. And that's another thing that I really liked about RM, the ability for us to extend it beyond its out-of-the-box capabilities. Just because you don't see a task in the toolbox, don't think that doesn't mean RM can do it. Just sit down, fire up PowerShell, and write the script necessary to do whatever it is that you need. And then add it as a tool to RM and start utilizing it and extend your RM to do whatever it is that you need it to do. Question in the back. The question is can I flip this based on the state of the release? Yes, because what I've done with this particular situation is I created a task. And the task will allow you to basically set or clear this retain indefinitely flag. And you get to put it anywhere in your workflow you want. So you could put it inside of a rollback, you could put it inside the start of a particular stage, or you could do it at any point that you wanted to, such that you can say, okay, if we're rejecting this guy, I want you to go ahead and clear that bit. The way that you would have to do that is that you would have to put it at the head of the next stage. So if the last thing is that the QA guy has to approve and it's going to go into the next stage, we can't do anything like an event firing of the approval, but that approval basically sends them into the next stage. So if I wanted to do something based on his approval, I would basically do it at the top of the very next stage. Say, I'm not sure I follow that part. Mm-hmm. Sure. If he rejects it, the next stage would not be called. Right, so your logic would have to be almost like the negate, right? If I want to set this to retain indefinitely only if they approve, then by default, as soon as the deployment started, I would clear the bit. And I would only reset it after he's approved it from one stage and it enters the next stage. It's like, okay, at this point, we want to make sure we keep this particular guy. Or the reverse, to where I default it to always being on, and based on his approval or rejection, I would clear it. Right? So you could flip the bit either direction, and depending on what my goal is, depends on how I want it to start. Do I want it to start locked, or do I want it to start unlocked? And based on their approval, do I want to relock it at one particular stage or another? It's a little. I think we can still achieve what you're wanting. The only downside would be that I approve it here, and the very first step I reject it, and we never enter the next stage. So there's going to be some weird scenarios that we're going to have to accompany for, but we did give you the ability to basically set or flip this, but where we do it, we'd have to talk about. To answer your immediate question, can I do this as a result of an approval? There is no mechanism to where, based on the approval, I now want to do this one little thing. I will just simply enter the next stage, at which point I would then do these things. Okay? Okay. Okay, no more hands. Oh, one more hand. Over behind you. I'll come back to you in a second. The PowerShell, not necessarily. If you're going to be using Windows Management Framework 4 or above, then you can start using desired state configuration, which we're going to get to.
Windows Workflow Foundation. You're using Windows Workflow when the recall is?
Not Workflow. Oh, no. The engine that actually runs RM is not Windows Workflow, is it? The current one it is, actually? Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, the current one is using the XAML workflow. Okay, you had a question here?
Yes, so we already talked about a couple of cool scripts
Mm-hmm.
and implementing them. Is there any plan to roll that in the next product?
Because they're, good question. Question was, you've talked about a lot of cool scripts that you've written. Are they going to be in the next product? I tell everybody, you have to learn PowerShell because you can use my exact same scripts already in the next product, right? They're not a task that are already there, but you will have the ability to extend our task list just like you do today in the next product, and you'll be able to take my same scripts and just upload them into the new system. Okay? All right, let's keep moving here. We'll go back. We only have like 20 minutes left. I want to make sure I get through them all here real quick. Azure. I kind of talked about this before we started. We can deploy to Azure with RM, our current system and our new system. We can go to any version of RM you want. We can use Azure PowerShell, which will allow you to use ARM or the Azure Resource Manager to spin up an entire environment, should you want to. We can target IaaS machines. IaaS are basically just virtual machines that live in the cloud. We can use those with DSC. I'm going to do them tomorrow. The machines I'm deploying to tomorrow are just Azure IaaS Linux machines. Right? So I just fired up 2 Ubuntu servers, and one's for dev and one's for QA, and they're just IaaS VMs sitting out there. I'm also using PaaS, because those Linux machines are hosting Java applications calling into web API that was written in .NET that is all hosted inside of PaaS in the websites. So I'm using 2 of these flavors already, and actually I'm using all 3 because SaaS is basically software as a service, and RMO and VSO are just SaaS offerings. So in that one demo, I'm using RMO, I'm using PaaS, and I'm using IaaS all in one demo. So it'll be a lot of fun to use a lot of with Azure. And we can actually use resource groups to be able to spin up those environments as well. How many of you guys are using your Azure benefits that come with your MSDN? How many of you guys have MSDN? Almost everyone, right? Oh, wow. Play with Azure. It's really cool stuff, and we give you free money every month. If you're a pro subscriber, you get $50. If you're a premium subscriber, you get $100. And if you're an ultimate subscriber, you get $150 of Azure every single month. You want to go play with Visual Studio 2015? We have a template of it in Azure right now. Don't install it if you don't want to. Just go up there and say, I would like a VM that has Visual Studio 2015 RC in it, and we'll spin one up for you just like that. You RDP to it, start having a blast with it, right? Use your benefits. You're literally just giving us that money back, right? So we give it to you, definitely spend it. Any questions on Azure? All right, we'll keep going. PaaS setup. So today, when we want to go out to a PaaS setup, normally what we do is we'll install an agent on the target machine. Well, in PaaS, there is no target machine, right? It's just a virtual directory. I don't actually have access to the machine to be able to install an agent on it, or to even run PowerShell against it, or to even run DSC against it. It's not even my machine. So how do I get access to be able to deploy to those environments? We changed the story I told you earlier, and we introduced something called a proxy server. So we're going to kind of move these guys over, and then we're going to slip in there another machine. What we're going to do is we're going to then target that machine and have him do the work for us on our behalf. That is the machine that's actually going to run the Azure PowerShell to deploy our PaaS solution or deploy to cloud services for us. This is a technique we use today in the current version, and happens to be the technique that we're going to be using in the next version as well. You can actually install an agent anywhere that you want. It's the same agent for build as it is for RM in the next version. And that server is the one that's going to be the springboard into whatever deployment you're going to be trying to do. Be it on-prem or otherwise, Azure, our cloud, doesn't matter, AWS. There's going to be an agent. And that agent will have what we call commitments. What is it called? We have demands and capabilities, that's the word I was looking for. So every agent will have a series of capabilities on it, like the capability to run Azure PowerShell, the capability to run coded UI test. I have my capabilities on mine have Azure PowerShell and Chef, right? Because I'm going to be using Chef in my demo tomorrow to get to those Linux machines. And we have different capabilities on the agent. The RM server is able to find the appropriate agent to do whatever it is that you want to do. We will then give him the information he needs, and then he will be able to then deploy your application to wherever it needs to go. I do. Very good question. Yes. I mean an actual agent. So this would be what we would do if we were doing agent-based deployment to a PaaS environment. We would have to have our agent sitting somewhere else. It's just a simple machine that has the ability to run the PowerShell necessary to get us to that particular machine. Now, in 2015, there was actually an agent, but the agent doesn't live on the machines. It literally is like a build agent, RM agent, test agent. It's an agent, right, that you are going to install somewhere. It could be in a IaaS VM or it could be on-prem. And that's what the RM server is going to talk to and say, okay, it's your responsibility to get these bits to where they're supposed to go. We can still use desired state configuration or PowerShell or Chef or Puppet to get to those machines, but there will be an agent between you and the target machines and the newer stuff. Okay? Okay. One more. Sure. Question is can I still use this agent to get across firewalls? The very first best practice about cross-domain and work groups, same applies here. right? The account that you're going to actually install the proxy server as, because it's just a Windows service, and you have to give it an identity that you want it to use to actually run the service. That service can be a shadow account to another domain, or it can be a user that has a trust to that other domain. So the same rules that I had mentioned about the cross-domain and workgroup mode apply to the user that you actually set up as the agent's identity account. No. A co-located agent is what we're going to be doing in the next version, where you'll actually be able to install the agent itself inside that domain. Of course, I don't see why that wouldn't work here either, right? We could do a co-located domain agent even of our new stuff. There's no reason that that wouldn't have worked. But you still would have to make sure that that account can see the server, the RM server. As long as that connection exists, no other connection needs to exist. We can get you all the bits that you need. All right, what do we have up next? I've lost the connection to my presentation. Oh, I'm just going through my animations. Deployment slots. We kind of talked about this. Do not swap across environments. In my demo on Thursday, don't do what you see me do. Okay? Because what you're going to see me do is you're going to see me swap from dev to QA. Don't do that. I'm doing that for demonstration purposes. There's a couple reasons you don't want to do that. Everything that I do in one stage, I want to repeat in every single stage. So by the time I get to production, I have done this a dozen times already. I don't want to, the first time I get to production, to be the first time I'm doing anything in my pipeline, right? Everything should be exactly the same. If I'm swapping slots, I don't want the first time I swap from staging to production to be in production. I would have wanted to go to a staging environment in dev and then swap to the dev environment. I'd want to go to a staging environment in QA and then swap to the QA environment, and then go to a staging slot inside of production and then swap to the production environment. I would have done it 3 times. I would have tested the script that's going to swap the slots 3 times. I would have tested everything at least 3 times. But if I only did this in the final slot, I would copy to my QA environment, I would have copied to my dev environment, my dev environment, then my QA environment. I would have copied to a production slot and then swapped for the very first time in production. Right? I wouldn't even have been able to test that my swapping was going to work the way that I expected it to. So you always want to do everything the exact same way. Another reason you don't want to swap across environments is because when you swap, you literally are swapping. It is not a copy. What used to be in one slot is now in the other, and what is in the other slot is now in the new slot. It's a swap of them, which means you could be putting code that no longer works in your dev environment that was just in your QA environment. Right? Because you're literally swapping this information. You're not deploying it again. Another thing that's dangerous about swapping is that if a stage fails, you can restart a stage. Like, oh, that stage failed. Oh, I know why, because the server did X, Y, Z. Let me fix that and then restart my stage. Well, if I swapped the first time and then you restart me, what I'm going to do? I'm going to take the code you thought was in there and I'm going to swap it out again. Right? So swapping doesn't work across domains when you have to restart a particular stage. But if what I do in that stage is I copy to the staging slot and then I swap it, even if you restart it, I'm going to copy to the files you want to the staging slot and then we're going to swap it again. You're going to get the same result every time you restart your slot, your stage. So if you restarting your stage will cause an issue, chances are you don't have your stage defined correctly. I should be able to restart it safely. Never swap across environments. Always swap inside the exact same environment. Okay? What else do we want to know about that? We talked about the data. Whoa. Did you guys see that? What is that? Oh, we just have someone hitting our slide there. Oh, sorry. Okay, I think that's better. Deployment slots. Oh, this was a really good one. So I spoke at an internal conference. Microsoft has 2 internal conferences a year called Tech Ready, where we all come together as Microsoft and make sure that all of our field resources are aware of what's coming next. And one of our internal customers, we use this ourselves, by the way. We invest in RM heavily because we use RM heavily inside of Microsoft. One of our internal customers actually was utilizing this with a system that already existed. They said, Donovan, we already have all of our secrets and all of our configuration data stored in an external database. We are not going to move all of that data inside of RM, right? But we want to utilize RM. So what they did was, because they were using VNext, which is all PowerShell, and PowerShell uses desired state configuration, you can pass desired state configuration, this is basically a hash table of values that you wanted to. And we can actually help you populate that from within RM. What they did instead is they actually had, as part of their pipeline, go to our current CMDB, pull back all the configuration data, and then build the hash table that RM would be building for us and give that to the desired state configuration. So they were able to leverage the investment in their current CMDB, not change any of that, still store their secrets and configuration data in the exact same way, but leverage all the power that is release management. So you don't have to re-architect everything that you've done. You don't have to remove everything that you do inside of RM to start using value of it. If you already have a CMDB, continue using it. All they did is they put a facade in front of it of a REST API. They call that REST API from PowerShell and pull in all the data that they need right over the wire. So it was really neat to be able to see how they were able to extend it beyond its bounds out of the box. Don't let the tools that we gave you restrict your imagination. Just because we didn't put the task in there doesn't mean you cannot do that. If it can be done from PowerShell, you can do it from release management. And this is a perfect example where someone went ahead and exploited that to a really, really cool result. Desired state configuration. I'm going to go over this really quickly. Best way to describe desired state configuration is to imagine a world without it, which is the world the majority of us live in today. It's a world where we make assumptions about the machine in which we're about to deploy to. If I am deploying an ASP.NET application, I would assume that that machine has IIS on it. If I'm deploying a database changes, I would assume that that machine has SQL Server on it. Based on those assumptions, I would then run some series of actions upon that machine. I would excopy files, try to execute my SSDT, and should everything match my assumptions, hopefully, we're in the desired state. However, if any of my assumptions were wrong, I could very well be looking at the yellow screen of death. Application did not deploy correctly because the assumptions of that particular environment were incorrect. Enter desired state configuration. Instead of assuming anything about the environment, I get to demand and describe exactly what that environment better look like. I get to say, you must have IIS installed on this server. You must have SQL Server installed on this server. You must have this port open on your firewall, and this user must be in that particular account. I get to demand this upon the system to which I want to deploy to. Desired state configuration will then take my desired state. It will get the current state of that machine. It will test it against my desired state, and should they not match, magically just make it so. It magically installs IIS should it need not be there. It will install the right version of the .NET framework if it's not there already. It will add users to groups. It will open up ports on the firewall. Whatever I've told the machine to do, it will magically do by itself and bring itself to the state that I need it to be in. The way that it does that is through little components called resources. There's a resource for opening up ports on your firewall. There's a resource for copying files around on the hard drive. There's a resource for installing features onto a server. And there wasn't a resource until I got involved that would tokenize your web.config for you. But the cool thing is that people like myself can actually write those and share those. So there's a lots of resources that have been added to the pipeline or to the collection by guys like myself, who basically saw a gap or saw a need for a particular resource that did not exist today. And we then share that for you so that you can download those resources and use them as part of your pipeline as well. The best thing of all this is that you now have configuration as code. You don't have a big 300-page document of what the server should look like. It doesn't take a week to wait for someone to go provision a machine and click all the next buttons on all the wizards to build up a machine that you need. You can literally stand up a machine and in a moment send it a description and it bring itself to that state. Just imagine if you need to scale out your farm. It's no longer waiting for the guy to go click all the next buttons to give you another machine that matches. And hope he clicks all the right next buttons and right check boxes, because if he doesn't, the machine stands up and when you try to add it to the farm, it won't go in, right? Because it doesn't match identically to those that already exist. But if I have my configuration as code and I can just give it to the server, it's instant that I can scale out my infrastructure. It's easy when I have a disaster and all my machines are gone, I can easily stand back up an entire environment because I know exactly what it's supposed to look like. And I can automate that deployment without having to wait for people to go click the buttons. Again, come to my talk on Thursday, at least for the first 2 minutes, and see exactly how important this is. Are there any questions over desired state configuration or what it is? So the question is there a resource to do Windows services?
Well, to do more of a workflow in ESC. So you stop a service, deploy your web code,
Right.
code, then restart it.
There is a way you could possibly do that, because what you can do is you can say, I need to ensure that something exists, or ensure that something is absent. I think it's ensure present or ensure absent. So if I really wanted to stop your service before I deployed it, I would simply send out a configuration that said, I need to insist that this guy is absent. And then would uninstall it. And then I can say that file copy depends on that guy. So there's actually a way that you can order the desired state configuration that says, before you can do the file copy, I insist that you run that resource first. And that resource will stop it. Go ahead.
You cannot start it afterwards because the key is only allowed once in one configuration.
The name of the actual resource itself. Exactly, but I can have the exact same file resource not the exact same file resource, but I can use the same resource multiple times in a configuration. So if I used a resource to stop a service, and then I had a file resource to copy the new files on there, I could have another service resource that would start a service again. I could put the absence.
For the same service. Because it has the same key. The key must be different.
The name of the service, the name of the resource is the key that I give it.
No. You have the key property for the resource. The key must be unique.
Yeah, but you can type anything you want into that key.
Not the name, the key parameter.
All right, we'll have to talk about that after because I've done what he's trying to do, so I'm not sure how we're misconnecting here. Yeah. So I'm not sure. We might be violently agreeing too, but I know that I'm able to sequence my resources so that I know what's going to happen in order, and every resource has a series of different parameters on it, and there is one that's identified as the key, but I'm pretty sure I've done exactly what he wants to do, so I don't know how I got around that now. Now you have me questioning myself. I wouldn't have used a script. Okay, you used a script resource to go ahead and deploy your Windows service?
To stop the service and then deploy it afterwards. But the key must be unique.
No arguments with the key being unique. No arguments there at all. But okay, we'll take this one offline. If you want to, you can come after and we can all have a cool chat on that one there as well. But there is a way to order your resources as they execute. There's a depends on command in every single resource that will say, I must happen after that one has already happened. So you should be able to get some sequence going that will generate what you want. And maybe we have to do a combination of different scripts because with a script resource, you might be able to do that as well. Okay, good talk. We'll talk further. What does desired state look like? This is what it looks like. Right? I've talked about it in a lot of scripts, but I haven't shown people what it looks like. It can be this simple. Actually, it can even be simpler than this because that ensure present is optional because the default for ensure is present. So I literally could have removed that line, and this will guarantee that every server that I point this to will have IIS installed on it. Right? It's that simple. It's not this big new language that you have to learn. It's not very complicated. You're basically putting demands saying, I would like you to install the web server, which is IIS, onto this particular machine. I can also pass in additional data. It allows me to separate what I want done from where I want it done. So this is basically a collection of all the machines to which I want to run the previous PowerShell against. So I don't have to hard code. If I have 100 machines that all need IIS installed on it, I don't have to copy that 100 times. I can literally put all 100 names in here and then pass that to the previous script. And this script will then run against all the machines that are identified in the other script. It separates where I want the actions done to the actions I actually want performed. So that again, scaling out a big infrastructure becomes very easy because this is always going to be the same for every machine, and all I have to do is add names over here to where I want that to actually be applied. So as you can see what PowerShell looks like. Agent-based versus vNext. How many are using agent-based today? A few of us are. Very cool, very powerful. I'm a big fan of it. Is agent-based a upgrade for vNext? Some will argue yes and no. They both have their pros and cons. If you are not using RM today, but you're thinking about using it tomorrow, I would encourage you to use the vNext solution. The reason why is because it is largely based in PowerShell and desired state configuration, files which are going to be very easily used in the new version of our software. There will be a migration plan automatically from our vNext product to our 2015 product. We currently do not have a plan in place for the agent-based solution automatically upgrading to the next version of our product. We will support the agent-based solution throughout all of 2015, so there's no panic of you having to get off of the agent-based solution today. It will be supported for the next entire product lifecycle. But you're probably going to want to start doing all your new deployments if you're using 2013 in the vNext product so that you effortlessly move to the 2015 when it goes live. The agent base was the very first version. It was available in updates 1 and updates 2. That required that you install a Windows service on the target machine to which you wanted to.
Updates for PFS 2013.
Yes, yes. Updates 1 and 2 for 2013 had RM where it was only agent based. That was the only way you could deploy. It required you installing an agent on the actual target machine so that we could then pull bits across to it. There was a way using a proxy server that you could kind of get around that, but nevertheless, it was still an agent-based solution. When we went to vNext, we actually stopped requiring you to install the agents on the target machines. We started using desired state configuration, which is basically already in WMF4, which is installed automatically on 2012 Server R2. So you didn't have to install anything. We could immediately start targeting those machines. But it didn't use the tools that we created in the first agent-based. It actually, everything was PowerShell or DSC. Going forward, essentially, we kind of have a mesh of the two. It has this huge list of tasks, but all those tasks are just PowerShell, right? So what you're going to be able to do if you're already using desired state configuration in the PowerShell solution that we have today, you're just going to be able to use those inside of our new solution as well. So it's a little bit different technologies. But if you're already using then vNext, great, you're in a good position to go ahead and upgrade naturally to the next one. If you're using agent-based, you'll have support throughout 2015, but after that it will be deprecated, I'm afraid.
Does Phoenix work in Visual Studio Online?
Yes, it's the only way to do it. Yep. Integration with Chef, we have it. I'll be showing it off tomorrow. And people are leaving, so I want to go ahead and get this up here real quick. This is the slide for your cameras. Everyone take a picture. You're going to get basically, I think, 4 hours. It's enough for an entire session. I'd hate to do this to myself. Do not waste your 4 hours on my session. It's all on the old stuff, unless you're doing 2013. If you're doing 2013, then my session will be very valuable to you. If you're going to be just introducing yourself to RM, use this code for a different session than my own. And I have like 2 minutes left. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to go do booth duty. So there's an ALM booth in the expo. You can come there and ask me all the questions that you want. Guys, thanks so much.